Radhe Radhe. Today is Saturday, 8th August 2026, and here we are to present to you this recap video for today's Bhagavad Gita study session. As you all saw in the session, we embarked on our next chapter. So the new chapter, chapter 14, we have begun its journey, and so we covered some content from there. We'll give you a tiny recap of that information. So as I bring up the slides, let's take a look at the cover slide. Of course, new chapter, so new cover slide, things for everyone to observe and ponder over. And we did cover chapter 14, verses 1 and 2. Of course, as it is a new chapter, we certainly start off with the chapter 14 opening prayer. Then I'll get into verse 1, explain, and then, of course, we'll talk about verse 2 as well. So, chapter 14, here we go. Om Shri Paramatmane Namaha अथ चतुर्दशोऽध्यायः गुणत्रयविभागयोगः श्रीभगवानुवाच परं भूयः प्रवक्ष्यामि ज्ञानानां ज्ञानम् उत्तमं यज्ञात्वा मुनयः सर्वे परां सिद्धिम् इतो गताः. So, chapter 14, verse 1 has the catchphrase as a question and alliteration. Similar scholarship, as we had discussed in the session, this is for us to think about, and we also then discuss the answer, yes and no. Yes, this is somewhat similar information that has been shared earlier by Sri Krishna, yet it's also going to be advanced, it's deeper because he gets into some new content to elucidate upon terms that we have seen before. And again, scholarship, remember, not as that sort of reward you sometimes get with great educational prowess. It's scholarship in terms of study, theoretical knowledge, spiritual knowledge, the study of anything in this case. So, similar scholarship, that's the question to ponder about. And indeed, as of course, we covered the introduction to chapter 14. So, we had our participants read the paragraphs here. Feel free to revisit those. And as we've always said, this is the introduction as well as a summary of the chapter. We read the introduction, we park it there, and then we start letting the verses unfold so we can literally see that journey being unveiled as it was to Arjun on that Kurukshetra battlefield. So, of course, chapter 14, Guna Traya Vibhag Yog, Yog through understanding the three modes of material nature. And in chapter 14, verse 1, Sri Krishna says that he shall once again explain to Arjun, to us, the supreme wisdom, the best of all knowledge. And he now shares also a reward for it, a spiritual treasure, by knowing which all the great saints attained the highest perfection. So the great saints in the past attained the highest perfection by knowing this knowledge imparted by Sri Krishna. Therefore, Arjun keeps that as a goal as well. And we vicariously through Arjun as well seek that as what our spiritual treasure ought to be. So, as we had mentioned in the session, we've said this many, many times. Mummy and I have used the phrase punarukti that Swamiji has introduced us all to way earlier in the Bhagavad Gita. Repetition. Repetition of terms, phrases, concepts that a skillful teacher, and of course, the most skillful Supreme Master, Sri Krishna, does for the benefit of the listener, the viewer, the reader. Because, as we said in the session, it's a long journey. Even on the battlefield, a few hours of discourse continuous. Here, we're talking many, many years of this collective journey together through these sessions and everyone's own individual work and discipline. And so to retain all that is difficult. It does need that constant repetition to be able to remind us of important things and to make everything deeper for us so that our understanding also is at a higher level. Therefore, no qualms, no hesitation. Sri Krishna once again is starting to explain this knowledge. So Swamiji tells us in the commentary that in chapter 13 that we just concluded last week, we had again revisited through the chapter quiz. All life forms are made up of the soul and the body, which is matter. The Prakriti, material nature, is what is responsible for cause and effect for creation. But for the soul, the Purush, that is the one that experiences happiness and distress. And so all this, of course, just doesn't happen like that. It is, of course, under the direction of the Supreme Lord, who, recall, as Paramatma, is seated in our hearts. The Supreme Soul is in the body of each living being. He is, remember, that supreme knower of all the fields. So Swamiji gives a preview that here, when we talk about this knowledge, more elaborate detail will be provided about the three gunas, the threefold qualities of material nature, and that spiritual treasure or reward that Sri Krishna alludes to or explicitly mentions as well for the saints. If we gain this knowledge, if we imbibe it in our consciousness, and then we have realized wisdom, experiential wisdom from inside, then we can ascend to the highest perfection. So that is chapter 14, verse 1. And if you all recall, I had taken us to chapter 2, verse 45. Chapter 2, verse 45 here is where Traigunya was first presented. Traigunya of the three modes of material nature. And indeed, Sri Krishna says the Vedas deal with the three modes of material nature. If one can rise above them to that state of spiritual consciousness, we will actually attain perfection. We'll be away from material gain and safety. We'll be situated in the self. We, of course, get that union with God. So that is chapter 2, verse 45. Now, also, as you remember, I had mentioned that chapter 14, verse 1, as you think about it, it is Sri Krishna setting context that he's going to reveal some or more wisdom. And here, of course, he says once again, I had asked us to think about all the different chapters, the beginning verse of which typically, as we said, is either about Arjuna asking a question or Sri Krishna doing something like he does in this chapter 14, verse 1. So you remember we took a tour and went to chapter 7, verse 1. That was where Sri Krishna has said, the Supreme Lord said, now listen, O Arjun. Listen, O Arjun. How, with the mind attached exclusively to me and surrendering to me through the practice of Bhakti Yoga, you can know me completely, free from doubt. So he lays the context for chapter 7 here about, of course, you need to be surrendered, you need to have the mind attached exclusively to the Supreme Lord. But what we're seeking is knowledge of God, knowing God better, knowing God completely. And here, of course, it is the seed, of course, of the most important Bhakti Yoga. So that's chapter 7, verse 1. Then you saw we had gone to chapter 9, verse 1. In that, the Supreme Lord has said, O Arjun, quality, attribute, because you are not envious of me, I shall now impart to you this very confidential knowledge and wisdom. And upon knowing that, oh, there's a reward, there's an outcome, you will be released from the miseries of material existence. So, again, now, beginning verse of a new chapter, chapter 9 in this case, the attribute of Arjun, of course, is mentioned. Earlier, it was because he was surrendered. And of course, he should have his mind exclusively attached to God. Here, because he is not envious of God, he gets to hear this knowledge. It is, of course, very confidential knowledge and wisdom. And the outcome is presented that if we follow that path, we'll be released from the miseries of material existence. We'll talk about that actually in chapter 14, verse 2 shortly. And then remember, the tour finished with chapter 10, verse 1. Here, the Blessed Lord said, listen again to my divine teachings. Listen again to my divine teachings. So that repetition aspect explicitly from the Lord. And he says, O mighty armed one, desiring your welfare because you are my beloved friend, I shall reveal them to you. So more qualities here. Because Arjun is Sri Krishna's beloved friend, he gets to hear this wisdom. And why does Sri Krishna do that? It's because he desires the welfare of Arjun. And therefore, he reveals his divine teachings and he does it again. So, this is that journey, that evolution, chapter after chapter, often the beginning verse of certain chapters, where now again we go back to chapter 14, verse 1, and it is Sri Krishna truly saying, he shall once again explain this supreme wisdom. And he tells us what the spiritual reward and that treasure will be at the end of it. Next up, then, let's look at chapter 14, verse 2. Idam jnanam upashritya Mama sadharmyam agataha sargepi nopachayante pralayena vyathanti cha. So that chapter 14, verse 2, the catchphrase also has alliteration and it also has scholarship. So again, scholarship, that study, that's knowledge, that wisdom. And it's saying scholarship as shelter. Because Sri Krishna says if we can take refuge, if we can take shelter in that wisdom, then we'll get something. We'll see what that is. But indeed, this verse is talking about scholarship being that shelter. So Sri Krishna says those who take refuge in this wisdom, they will be united with him. Aha, yog, union, that ultimate perfection that we seek, coming by taking refuge in this wisdom of Sri Krishna. And then he further talks more about what that spiritual reward really then entails. They will not be reborn at the time of creation, nor destroyed at the time of dissolution. So Swamiji starts off the commentary by saying that this is Sri Krishna giving an assurance. The assurance to Arjun and vicariously to all of us is that if we equip ourselves with this knowledge that Sri Krishna has been bestowing and is about to continue to bestow more and more of, then we don't have to have this suspended state. Two examples. One is that repeated confinement in the mother's womb. We talked about that in the session. The child is there for 9 or so months, really then yearning to come out into the material world. The material world, of course, has its own, right, struggles as well as different levels of happiness, but that is one lifetime. And then you look at so many different lifetimes, so many different life forms in a single lifetime as well, in a single cycle of creation. One can have any of those 84 lakh, 8.4 million species of living beings, each its own different kind of womb, each its own different kind of state of repeated confinement. And when that dissolution finally also takes place, we talked about this. I also mentioned chapter 8, verses 17 and 18. We just coincidentally had revisited those through a quiz or summary in the life lessons from the Bhagavad Gita session just on Wednesday this week. Coincidence, but that is the other part Swamiji mentions, the suspended animation in the womb of God. So remember, when that entire cycle of creation finishes, when that day and of Brahma finishes, then it goes to the equivalent duration, the night of Brahma, the dissolution portion. Then everything reverses back. You can say it unfolds or folds back in to where it came from, which is the latent energy state. So it's in a non-manifest energy state in the womb, in the pores of God. We actually get away from all that if we take refuge in this wisdom. That's what we are learning here from Sri Krishna. Remember, we've talked about chapter 6 as well as Bhakti Shatak by Maharaj Ji. The mind is the cause of bondage. It's also the cause of liberation. You can choose to make it that. So, indeed, because it is how we act through the gunas, the three modes of material nature, they are therefore the cause of bondage. And if we have knowledge of them, we can have illumination of how to get away from that, how to escape this path of bondage. Next paragraph, Swamiji then does talk about how this strategy of Sri Krishna is very deliberate. As I had mentioned, he is repeating concepts and terms, that's punarukti, but a little more than even some other verses or chapters. Here, he's in both the verses talked about the results of what one can attain. Interesting contrast because materially we don't seek a reward, but we are, of course, hoping for that spiritual reward of God's grace, God's love, God's seva. And so those results, those that we know that's going to be the highest perfection, is coming about in Sri Krishna's words. He tells us why he does that is because he wants Arjun and each of us to be in rapt attention. So if you remember, we had suggested putting this in your English dictionaries, rapt attention, very, very absorbed in the material that is at hand. But also, one more thing, two-pronged, we mentioned, the true origin of the word comes also from being enthralled by or fascinated by and inspired by, especially something that is really, really based on wisdom, religious information, theoretical knowledge. So it's a very suitable word here, rapt attention. And then, of course, some Sanskrit phrases we discussed in the session, na vyathanti. They will not experience misery. If you remember, we saw it in one of the earlier verses that I took you to in one of the earlier chapters. There also it said they will not experience misery. So that is na vyatanti. And then sadharmyam, the soul, tiny fragment, energy-based fragment of the Supreme Soul. We aim to become godlike. We can do that, of course, only through the grace of God, through that union. And so sadharmyam means that soul will acquire a similar divine nature. I talked about the story of the guard dog at a house. The dog barks at us. That's representative of Maya. But when the owner comes out, when God recognizes that we are truly purified and ready for the grace of God, then Maya is told to step aside and Yog Maya is bestowed upon us. That divine Yog Maya energy gets us the grace of God. Recall, the grace is divine knowledge, divine love, divine bliss. And so all of that eventually helps the soul take on and become that nature of God, become like God, acquire divine godlike qualities. So that is chapter 14, verse 2. And let's, of course, not forget, let's cover a couple of very important Sanskrit words. We saw several of them, of course, in the session, highlighted here in green. Let's look at, I think, pravakshyami. We've actually seen this before, but it is again stressing importance on how all this is emanating from the Lord Himself. I shall explain, Sri Krishna. Pravakshami, I shall explain. That's from chapter 14, verse 1. And then from chapter 14, verse 2, let's look at upashritya, take refuge in. Because this chapter, of course, is going to talk more and more about this supreme and confidential knowledge in which we should take, or under which we should take refuge and shelter. Many other words, of course, sadharmyam, we saw navyatanti. Keep on looking at all of them as well, but certainly these are a few to call out right now. And let's not forget, we have our flyer to talk about. We saw that in the session. New chapter, of course. You have the image, and the question is, where should you take refuge to be united with God? And indeed, as we had discussed, we know the answer now. Chapter 14, verse 2, take refuge in this wisdom. We have these devotees of the Lord eligible, and we hope to be like them, approaching God, God waiting with open arms, waiting to embrace us literally and figuratively, so that we get that union with Him. It's going to happen only if we are standing literally under the right shelter. So if you look at the arch here with the glass panes, on these panes, as you can see, we have put in scriptures and scrolls. So that is divine wisdom, divine knowledge. If we take refuge of this wisdom, the wisdom by which great saints had achieved perfection, the wisdom that is coming from Sri Krishna, then we can be united with God. So that is the essence today of chapter 14, verses 1 and 2, of course, along with the opening prayer, the invocation for the chapter itself. So similar scholarship, chapter 14, verse 1, scholarship as shelter, chapter 14, verse 2. With that, we look forward to seeing you next week. So that will be Saturday, 15th August, 2026. So coincidentally, India's Independence Day. Certainly, we should partake in the blessings and grace and this wisdom, this refuge offered and given to us by the Supreme Lord. So 8 a.m. Central Time, 6:30 p.m. India time. Till then, thank you so much. Radhe Radhe.